minute or two to sign in and join us. So if you are already, if you're already with us, welcome. We're really excited for this conversation today. And we're just, as I just mentioned, giving folks a minute or two to join. Really looking forward to this conversation. And if you find this conversation to be very interesting and stimulating, and you would like to hear more vital conversations like this one, then I really encourage you to sign up for J Street's upcoming conference, which will be in December. You can learn more about that and register for it at jstreet.org/conference. So I really encourage all of you to do that. And again, welcome folks who are just tuning in and signing on. So let me go ahead and kick us off and introduce myself. My name is Deborah Shushan. I'm the Director of Government Affairs here at J Street. We're going to be having a conversation here today about Ukraine, the refugee crisis, and how the awful invasion and war in Ukraine have played out within Israeli politics. We've got two great speakers with us today, and our webinar is going to occur, for your information, in two parts. So first, I'll be having a conversation with Naomi Steinberg of HIAS about the refugee crisis. And then at around 12:30, the conversation will shift, and I'll be speaking with Tal Shalev, an Israeli journalist at Walla News, about how the conflict has played out in Israeli politics. So as we get started, I just want to make a note for everyone that a key part of our JStream conversations here at J Street is always giving you who are tuning in with us the opportunity to ask questions of our speakers. So I'll just point out now that at any point in the conversation, if you have a question for our speaker, you can go to the Q&A button that you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to go ahead and submit your question. We'll have a point in the conversation where we'll open the discussion to questions from our viewers at home. So with that said, I want to start out the refugee portion of our conversation by welcoming Naomi Steinberg from HIAS. Naomi is the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at HIAS. HIAS, as I'm sure many, most, or all of you know, is a very important organization, good friend of J Street, which provides vital services to refugees and asylum seekers around the world. And it advocates for their fundamental rights so that they can rebuild their lives. Previously, Naomi was the Director of Refugee Council USA and the Deputy Director of the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center. Naomi, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. It's an honor to be here with you.
Oh, you're so kind. We're really, really pleased to have you. So as we get started with our conversation, I'll just mention that, as our viewers, I'm sure know, here at J Street, our bread and butter issues are related to diplomacy in the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, diplomacy with Iran. But as I'm sure many or most or all of you know, we also get involved in issues where our Jewish values do not enable us to stay silent. And one of those has been refugees, immigration, rights of asylum seekers. And of course, on those issues, HIAS is a vital partner for J Street. And we feel very privileged for the opportunity to work together with HIAS, to take the opportunity to sign on to letters advocating for things like temporary protected status for Ukrainians in the US, for increased refugee resettlement in the US for Ukrainian refugees, and things like that, things that we'll be talking with Naomi about today. So Naomi, as we get into our conversation, can we start with a description of the situation, how you would characterize this profound refugee crisis in terms of its volume and other characteristics.
Well, thank you again. The feeling is mutual. We really count on J Street as a tremendous partner. But to answer your actual question, I think the first word that pops into my mind when I think about this Ukrainian refugee crisis is it's unprecedented. It's not that there aren't refugees from other countries, from other groups that number in the same amount. We are now, I should say, at 4 million, a little more than 4 million Ukrainians have fled Ukraine. More than that are internally displaced within Ukraine. 1 in 4 Ukrainians are forcibly displaced. These numbers are staggering, but what is particularly staggering is the rapidity with which they have been displaced. This crisis started a month ago, essentially, and we have not seen anything like this, the size and the scope and the speed at which people have been displaced since World War II. Excuse me. So, of course, there are millions upon millions still of Syrian refugees. There are millions upon millions of Burmese refugees when you combine all the groups, Somalis, Afghans, the list go on, but we have never seen this number of people be forcibly displaced this quickly. It is mind-boggling and deeply sobering.
Well, it would appear we lost Deborah, everybody. So we're just going to vamp for just a moment. But Naomi, if you want to tell a little bit more about the work that you and HIAS have been doing in the recent weeks while we wait for Deborah, and then we can move from there.
Sure, of course. Luckily, this is something I'm used to speaking about, so it's no problem. So I'm not sure that a lot of people know that HIAS has been operational in Ukraine in one way or the other since 2001. We started in Ukraine in 2001 to assist Jewish people who were emigrating from the United States, from Ukraine to come to the United States. Today, our presence in the country is in partnership with an organization called Right to Protection, an independent Ukrainian non-governmental organization founded by HIAS Ukraine in 2014. So what we have been doing since the beginning of the crisis is we've been helping R2P, Right to Protection, to make sure that they have the resources and the materials they need to respond to what's going on. So that includes linkages and referrals for Ukrainians fleeing the conflict and anticipated long-term displacement. Our emergency focus with them is on cash assistance, psychosocial support, and legal protection services, including offering assistance on how to safely leave the country. And keep in mind, all of our colleagues' staff, they were in danger too, because they were all displaced. Many of them had to flee from Eastern Ukraine to get to relative safety. And I put that, of course, in quotes, in the West. So once they were relocated and nominally safe, they really began kicking into gear again. And it's beyond commendable. So some of the new things that they've been doing is they've established a legal hotline to provide legal consultation and assistance and coordination. They've also provided more than 400 tons of humanitarian non-food items, including blankets and kitchen sets and basic utensils, as well as food. So that's what we're doing with R2P. And HIAS is, as ourselves, is actually actively recruiting for emergency specialists to be on the ground. They're primarily focused on mental health, cash assistance, and broader humanitarian operations to work shoulder to shoulder with R2P. And I should say that while HIAS is working with the most vulnerable Ukrainians, we are not focused on Jewish Ukrainians per se. We are focused on those who are in the most need, and that certainly can include Jews, but not exclusively. Our primary focus right now is working with women and girls and LGBTQ plus refugees, as well as some of the 5,000 non-Ukrainian asylum seekers, the majority of which were from Afghanistan, who were in Ukraine before the war started. And it's important to us to say that while a part of our response has certainly been rooted in the Jewish community, and I'm really proud to talk about that in a second, it is our job as a refugee organization to serve all of those in need. But what we have been doing with the Jewish community is we have been supporting the Jewish communities in Poland and Moldova and Slovakia by providing them with the resources and the materials so that they can help the Ukrainian refugees who are pouring into their communities. So we have really focused on making sure that Jewish communities can respond. And as a matter of fact, some of my community engagement colleagues just got back from Paris, where they co-hosted a training with more than 70 Jewish representatives from 17 European countries who were all there to learn from HIAS about what does it really mean to welcome refugees? How do you do this in a formalized but still welcoming way? And so I'm so proud of that work. And so, yeah, it covers the spectrum. And we've also had our emergency response team on the ground since March 1st, helping to get all of this up and going. So it has certainly been a very busy programmatic time with HIAS.
We can imagine. And it looks like, Deborah, we have you back. So I will go back to being the IT person, and Deborah go back to being the moderator, and take care.
Thank you so much, Nate, for stepping in there. That was really exciting. My screen just, suddenly went black and computer died. And, but we're all professionals at this point in COVID and know exactly what to do when that happens. So thank you so much for that, Naomi. If you could reflect for a moment on something that I've been thinking about, which is that HIAS, and just so that our viewers know, HIAS was founded back in 1881 as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society to assist Jews who were fleeing pogroms from exactly this part of the world, from Russia and Eastern Europe. I'm sure many of the folks who are tuning in with us today probably have family that left this part of the world, that fled this part of the world around that time in the succeeding decades. I know that's true for me, for my own family. And Naomi, I wonder if you could reflect for yourself, for your colleagues, what it's like for HIAS to once again be helping refugees flee war in exactly this part of the world from which so many of our family members fled decades ago.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think something with which we've all been grappling since the start of this, because our history as an organization, certainly at HIAS, but certainly as a community of American Jews, of course, we are deeply rooted to this part of the world. And at HIAS, we are rooted to this part of the world, not only because many of our families come from there or came from there, but we have staff who have families who are still there and who have now become refugees. I have colleagues who now have siblings who are now finding themselves in Romania all of a sudden because they couldn't stay. And of course, our Right to Protection colleagues, the organization I was just discussing, they feel like family to us. And so to know what they've been going through personally while still keeping the work going has been both inspirational and heartbreaking. But I think this crisis took all of us by surprise in many respects, because even though we saw what was happening on the borders, we knew something was going to happen. Even the UN Refugee Agency, even other UN agencies were taken aback. And this is something I spoke about at the beginning, about the speed with which this was displayed, the displacement crisis, and then the sheer scale of it. Again, it is 1 in every 4 Ukrainians are now forcibly displaced, and 4.1 million of them have crossed international borders. And so I think we are reeling from this in many different ways, both with the immediate tasks in front of us in terms of making sure that we are serving the displaced as best as we can. And I think we're reeling from the fact that none of us anticipated seeing a refugee crisis like this again in Europe. I think we were all operating under the, turns out, erroneous assumption that those days were behind us. And so it's been very difficult. But at the same time, we are in a unique place at HIAS to respond to this crisis. Because we have been operational in one way or the other in Ukraine for so long now, but because we do have such a deep connection to that part of the world. And one of the things that's markedly different, though, is while we, of course, are serving Ukrainian Jews who are fleeing, what is of note is that they are fleeing because they're Ukrainians. They're not fleeing because they are being persecuted as Jews. And that is a tremendous development, and that is not meant to minimize their trauma or everything they're going through, but it really shows our evolution as an organization, that we are now serving all Ukrainians and that we are not being called on to serve Ukrainians who are fleeing because of their faith. We are serving Ukrainians of all faiths. And as we like to say at HIAS, I think some of you might have heard us say this before, we used to help refugees because they were Jewish, and now we help refugees because we are Jewish. This is our calling as a people, and it is baked into who we are. And so we're putting that into action right now.
Absolutely. And we're so proud of that work and all that you do, absolutely, as part of that community. Naomi, I wonder if we could talk a little bit now about the U.S. government. And of course, your work is with policy and advocacy. And of course, so much of that is directed toward the U.S. government. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about where that advocacy that you are engaged in is focused with the U.S. government, what the U.S. government has done, what you hope that it will still do.
Yeah, it's a good question. This conversation is happening at a fortuitous time because we are in the mix of it. This is really continuing to be the primary focus of my work right now, my team's work right now. Let me tell you first what the Biden administration has done. One is it had granted, or I should say designated, Ukraine for temporary protected status. And what that means is for those Ukrainians who are already in this country at the start of the war, they are able to stay after going through an application process. They're able to stay here for 18 months, which is renewable, and they're able to work here. What that essentially does is it gives them some breathing room to try to figure out what it is that they want to do. They will not be forced to return home. So that was the first thing. That was a good piece of news. The administration has also been extraordinarily generous, and of course with the support of Congress, in terms of the humanitarian assistance we are providing overseas. I don't think we frequently think about humanitarian assistance going to Poland and to Moldova and Slovakia, but they are absorbing millions of people. And so the humanitarian assistance overseas is also a huge part of this, and we continue to be leading on that. What we saw recently, though, was that the administration announced that they are going to be admitting 100,000 Ukrainians. We applauded that announcement, but what we also noted is that announcement was big on vision, short on details. We have no idea what that really means, and this is where our advocacy is really focused now. We don't know of that 100,000, how many are coming this year, how many are coming next year. Of that 100,000, we don't know how many are coming through the U.S. refugee resettlement program and how many might be coming through other legal pathways, including humanitarian parole. We don't know if cases will be expedited. We don't know if this will include some of the people we're talking about who should come to the United States, we believe, including the former asylum seekers from other countries. We have always, from the very beginning, recognized that this is primarily a European response, and that most Ukrainians, the vast, vast majority, want to go home as soon as it is safe, and in the meantime want to stay as close to Ukraine as possible for a lot of different reasons, not the least of which is that their male relatives, most of them, are still in Ukraine, husbands, fathers, brothers, you name it. But we still think that the US has a role to play in terms of welcoming Ukrainians. So primarily our focus has been on family reunification cases. Talk about a population that should not be stuck in Europe waiting. They don't want to be there. They want to be here with their loved ones. And so our focus has been get these family reunification cases to the United States as quickly as possible, and do so through the refugee resettlement program. This is the main thing we are hammering with the administration now, and literally, to the minute. We have other colleagues on calls with the administration literally now, and then again this afternoon, and with other advocates. And the reason why we are making this point is what we saw with the recent arrival of Afghans is that many of them, thousands upon thousands, came with what is known as humanitarian parole, which is in fact not an immigration status. It lets you in the country, it lets you stay here, in the case of the Afghans, for up to 2 years and to work, but it doesn't give you any automatic right to becoming a legal permanent resident, to getting your green card and getting on a path to citizenship. It precludes you from reuniting with your families. And so we have been pushing since day one of the Afghan arrivals for Congress to pass what is known as an Afghan Adjustment Act, which would allow them to adjust their immigration, to adjust their status so that they can get their green cards. And the reason why I'm diverting a little bit to talk about that Afghan experience is we do not want to see that happen again with Ukrainians. We want them to come through the refugee resettlement program so that they are able to really start their lives anew. Because what's going to happen with the Afghans is the only way they can stay permanently now is if they go through the asylum process, which is notoriously difficult, notoriously backlogged. And to do that again to another group of refugees is really, really a disturbing prospect to us. And so one of the arguments we've been given is, well, we know Ukrainians want to go home. And that's true, and that's great. But for those Ukrainians who don't want to go home, they need to have access to being able to get their green cards and all that that bestows upon them. And even for those who do want to return home, you can still do that having gone through the refugee resettlement program. You're not bound to stay here forever, but we need to have the flexibility that the US Refugee Admission Program brings. So we have been coming out publicly and loudly swinging against the concept that thousands upon thousands of Ukrainians should come through the humanitarian parole program. We think that that would be an egregious mistake. So those are the conversations we're having with the administration right now.
Thank you so much, Naomi. And I just want to welcome Tal Shalev, who I see joined us. She'll be featured in the second part of our conversation. And so we'll get to that in just a little bit. I do note that a few folks have put questions in the Q&A, which is fantastic, and encourage more folks to do that. I'm actually going to go to a question now that came into us from Eva Seligman-Kennard. She asks, Naomi, where are the Ukrainians at the US-Mexico border suddenly coming from? They've come such a long way in a short amount of time.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So Ukrainians don't need visas to get into Mexico. So those who have had the resources and have chosen to take this path have been able to fly to Mexico with many of them having the intent of getting to the US-Mexico border and then being able to seek asylum here. So we are seeing those numbers grow. And I would say that there has been a relatively significant amount of media attention for a relatively small number of Ukrainians. I don't want to blow out of proportion the numbers that we're seeing, but they have been increasing, to be sure. And what we have been saying from the very start of this, when we became aware that Ukrainians were at the border, is yes, absolutely, they should be able to get into the United States and to apply for asylum. But what was happening at the same time, while those Ukrainians were able to come in, other asylum seekers were still being expelled under what the policy is known as Title 42. And I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. That is a whole other discussion. But what we have been saying is we don't expect Ukrainians to be treated as terribly as asylum seekers from other countries. What we expect is that asylum seekers from all countries should be treated with the same dignity and respect that Ukrainians have been afforded at the border. And that's not to say it's been a walk in the park for them, but it was a real tough pill for many of us to swallow when we saw some Ukrainians getting in and many from Haiti and Central America continuing to be expelled immediately. So those Ukrainians who have been able to get in, who've been fortunate enough to get in, have gone to where their families are and are able to continue the asylum process in this country. So they really have scattered. We know at HIAS that some of our local partners in California are seeing many of them. For example, our partner in San Diego, Jewish Family Services in San Diego, have been directly serving Ukrainians. But I just got an email from somebody who works on our US program side who said that some Ukrainians showed up at one of our offices in Michigan. I mean, so they really they're going to where they have community, and there's just no way to predict how many more Ukrainians will come in that way.
Thank you so much for that, Naomi. So I want to talk a little bit about the outlook, the longer term outlook. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that, that most Ukrainian refugees will want in, the medium to longer term to go back to their homes in Ukraine. And we have a question from Ellie Goldberg, which I think is an important one. She asks, how can anyone go home to places that are totally destroyed, no homes, no infrastructure? So if you could answer that, and if you have a sense, I know this is a really tough question, but how many Ukrainians, what percentage do you think will be able to go back? And maybe if you could draw from, other crises around the world, what percentage of refugees generally are able to go back to their homes after a situation like we see here?
Yeah, I mean, the situation is so unique in terms of, as I said, in terms of the speed with which many parts of Ukraine have been destroyed and the speed with which so many people have had to leave. It is impossible to say out of the 4.1 million who have left, how many want to go home. But to a person, When our colleagues have been talking to people, every single one, literally every single one has said, we want to go home. And of course, that is anecdotal. We have not spoken to 4.1 million people, but that is the general consensus. But you're right, people can't go home now. When cities have been obliterated, there's literally no place for them to go to. So we are not operating under the false assumption or the naive hope that people will be able to go home the second that the guns are put down. Although, of course, we hope that that happens immediately for obvious reasons. It will take time. But one of the things that should be really celebrated, with a slight caveat, is that the European Union countries have been extraordinarily generous in their welcome of Ukrainians. And that's not to say that people, as welcome as they might be in Poland, in Germany, in the UK, that's amazing. But people still want to go home. But even so, they are safe now. And what the European Union has done is they've instituted very quickly what's called a temporary protective directive, which means that for up to 3 years, and it requires renewing this, but for up to 3 years, Ukrainians can stay in these EU countries and they can work and they can access public benefits. Their kids can go to school. They have assistance with housing. So there is not an immediate rush for them to return. They can wait and see what it looks like for the rebuilding of Ukraine. I think what the real question is going to be is, as that 3-year period comes to an end, if the welcome will be waning, that's hard to predict. But I will say the caveat to the European Union's response to this is that it's sort of what I was saying about asylum at our border. We do not wish that European Union countries turn Ukrainians away, but it cannot be lost on us that some of these very same countries, not that very long ago, were doing everything they possibly could to keep Syrians and Afghans out. There are images, burned upon some of our memories about images from the borders. And so we commend these countries for doing the right thing. This is absolutely the right thing. It is a phenomenal, phenomenal response. But our hope is that moving forward, once people have seen what it looks like to really welcome refugees and that Europe is capable of doing this in a big, meaningful way, that the next refugee crisis, because there will be another, that the same response is afforded to refugees from other parts of the world. That is what our hope is, and that's what we'll push for.
Naomi, there's just so much to dig into, I feel like, in what you just said. I mean, one thing that I want to note as we look at this, these aren't, the latest up-to-date figures, but at some point recently, I read that the number of refugees in Poland was, Ukrainian refugees coming to Poland was 2 million, maybe higher than that now. We're talking about a country with a population of 38 million. So if you extrapolate that to the US population, right, if we were to take in that many refugees, per capita, we'd be talking about 20 million refugees coming into the US in short order. So just to give a sense of the magnitude, I mean, it really is incredible, right?
No, it's astounding. And so it's also one of those circumstances where I feel like the US, we really need to show some real solidarity here. In addition to the humanitarian assistance, what we do with this 100,000 commitment that the Biden administration makes means a lot. So when our Polish counterparts are doing exactly that, welcoming 2 million refugees, it is literally the least we can do to help 100,000 for whom being in the United States is really the right thing. So family reunification cases. And, when I talk about these asylum seekers who were in Ukraine before the war started, from Afghanistan, from a variety of African countries, from a variety of Middle Eastern countries, you name it, from major refugee-producing countries, we are not convinced that they are going to have the same welcome in European countries that the Ukrainians are, even though technically they are entitled to receive all of the benefits from this temporary protection directive. The jury is out about what that will look like, which is why we are really focusing in on that population as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, I'm sure many of us have, as we've watched this crisis unfold, it hasn't been lost on us. The difference between the way that European white refugees are treated and immigrants from, refugees from other parts of the world, from Africa, from the Middle East. And I'm, it's good to hear that is something that's very top of mind for HIAS as well.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, Naomi, unfortunately, I have to let you go in just a minute or two. But there is one question that I absolutely want to make sure that we ask you. It's a question that comes to us from Michelle Altimus, but I am sure that it is on the minds of many of our listeners. And that is the question, how can we help? And specifically, Michelle asks, is there an opportunity for people to volunteer with HIAS?
Well, that is just my favorite question of all time. The answer is yes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the chat so you can all see two different links. One is a link specific to the Ukrainian response. So if you're particularly interested in supporting HIAS in our work with this particular crisis, there is a way to do that. But then there are also many ways to volunteer with HIAS, not just in response to this crisis. And I'm going to put our general take action link in there. And there you can see about not just how you can volunteer, but how you can do advocacy with us and how you can join our HIAS programming. So take a look at those links. And if you have questions after looking at those, let's figure out a way for you to reach out to me too. I don't know if there will be a follow-up email here or something in which we can share my email address, but please do follow up because we want to make sure you find the right volunteer opportunity. But these links should be a good first start.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And let me just see, did you put that into the chat? Have we put in?
No, I'm going to right now. As soon as I
put the links into
I'm going to do that right now. Yes.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And so, Naomi, I just really want to thank you so much for this conversation. We've just kind of scratched the surface here in a half an hour, but this has been really important and really helpful. And just really want to, again, give you J Street's thanks for the vital work that you all at HIAS do. You make us all proud, and we're here with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really our pleasure. All right, so we're going to shift gears here a little bit, and I am going to welcome our next guest, Tal Shalev. Tal, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to continue on the subject of Ukraine, but we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about how the crisis, invasion, war in Ukraine has played out in terms of Israeli politics and in terms of Israel's response. So let me just introduce Tal. She is the chief political correspondent for Walla News, which is the largest Israeli website that provides independent breaking news and analysis 24 hours a day. She covers Israel's prime minister, government, and parliament, which of course is the Knesset, as well as the country's foreign and diplomatic affairs. And she has over a decade of extremely varied and rich career in journalism. And so, Tal, it is my pleasure to welcome you today.
Hi, Deborah. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you here today. So, Tal, there's a lot to dig into in terms of Israeli politics and Israel's reaction. I'll just remind folks, folks have been really good about submitting their questions in the Q&A, but if you do have questions in this part of the conversation for Tal, please do feel free to go ahead and submit your questions. Tal, the way I'd like to start is, let's start with Bucha and the news out of Bucha over the weekend. As I'm sure many of our viewers will have seen, there are towns immediately outside of Kyiv where the Ukrainian forces have been able to retake them after a month or so in which they were under Russian control. And the pictures from Bucha and other places are just absolutely horrifying in terms of people with their hands bound, shot, tortured, mass graves. And the Israeli government's response to this has been in some ways kind of a microcosm of its response to this broader crisis. And so I wonder if we could start right there with you giving some analysis of what that response has been to this most recent news.
Hi everyone, and I'm happy to be here. I'll try to explain, in Israel, everything is always complicated, and this is a complicated issue as well. you're totally right that this is like a microcosmos, the reaction to Bocha, because basically we did not have an official reaction, not from the prime minister or even an official reaction from the foreign ministry at all. But we did have the foreign minister, Yair Lapid, tweet last night, his condemnation, I think, it wasn't a very strong condemnation, but it was a condemnation to war crimes and the horrible, really the horrendous visions coming out of Bocha. And I should just mention that there is actually an Israeli journalist from Israel's Channel 1, like the public TV, the state-controlled TV, which has been in Ukraine for the past month or so and is actually in Bocha. So actually Israelis yesterday had like real exclusive horrible footage, but it really was in Israel's face in that respect. But only Lapid reacted, and maybe some other ministers who were asked about it in interviews, then they would denounce it. But as an official reaction, basically you only had Lapid and the ambassador who reacted shortly afterwards. And the policy of Israel throughout the whole month or so that this has been going on has been kind of a good cop, bad cop, I would say. Good cop, bad cop is simplistic, but to talk in two voices at the same time. And if you look throughout all the way, you will see that Lapid has been much stronger in his condemnations of Russia, and he's using a much harsher language against Russia, while Bennett hardly mentions Russia by its name, and has, of course, at least started on this mediation project somewhere in the beginning of the war. The mediation project, from what I sense right now, A, didn't really succeed or matter, and B, also has been pushed aside in Israel's own agenda, because we've had a very bad security week. There have been 3 terror attacks, and that totally like pushed aside everything that's happened in Ukraine from public attention. It's been a horrible week here in Israel as well. But I think that the policy will continue to be, we'll see that like Lapid is like the more Western guy. He's trying to appease the US, he's trying to appease the West. We saw Lapid fly to Europe, fly to the Eastern European countries a few weeks ago during the crisis. And Bennett trying to keep himself neutral in this place that he can still mediate and can still be welcomed by Russia.
So, I mean, it's a fascinating dynamic, Tal, that you've shared there, and I wonder if you can give us your analysis as to why you see this kind of divided response. Is this just differences between these two individuals and their approaches? Do you see this as coordinated?
No, I think it's totally coordinated. For sure, it's coordinated. Listen, Israel is in a much more complex situation than many other countries in the West, because there's a huge Russian presence on our northern border, and it has a lot of importance to a lot of strategic interest that Israel has in the north, in Syria, and the way Israeli planes can operate in Syria. As you know, according to foreign sources, Israel operates on a regular basis in Syria, and all of this it can do because it has a very good coordination and relationship with Russia. And also, so to begin with, the whole situation is a bit more complex. To add on to this, I think we have a prime minister who really wanted to prove himself and really he wanted to do good, but B, he wanted to prove himself and find himself this unique place, in the international arena, and to be one of the rare Western leaders that can actually pick up the phone and have a constructive discussion with Putin and Zelensky, both Putin and Zelensky. And I do think that there was a genuine will to try and use this unique situation, even though personally I think you know, I think it was a weird idea to begin with. I don't think that Bennett would be solving this crisis. I think he was stepping, you know, one step too high for our league. I think we're a very small country, but this is my personal view. Most Israelis do support the neutral position that Israel is taking because of this, you know, fear from the Russian bear in the north. That being said, we should also say that as opposed to other Western countries and that I think have negative positions toward President Putin, growing negative positions in the past decade or so towards President Putin. In Israel, up until the beginning of the war, President Putin was an extremely popular leader. He was considered one that has a very good relationship with Israel, both with the former prime minister and with the current prime minister. And I think at large there is there's this place in Israel that wants to maintain that relationship and is afraid of ruining that relationship because of this Russian presence here, right, in the area. So I think that Bennett is trying to walk this very, very thin line, but again, Israel is a nation amongst the nations, and it knows what the US expectation is, and it knows what Europe's expectation is, and it knows what public opinion expectation is in many of these countries. So I think in that respect, Lapid is taking the Western liberal side, and at the same time, that way, Lapid, by being a foreign minister, can say much more far-reaching things, and Bennett can keep this pose of neutrality. And by the way, I think in many places you see that in many countries you can see that foreign ministers sometimes use a much harsher language than the leader has. It's kind of there is a division of power in many relationships between the prime minister and his foreign minister, and in this case, since, you know, Bennett and Lapid are not only prime minister and foreign minister, they are both the heads of the government. So it actually works out very well, this two-voice talking.
Interesting. Okay. So I want to follow up on a couple of things there. One is Israeli public opinion, which is very interesting. And you mentioned that, you know, Putin was very popular before the war. And so, you know, for those of us who hearken back to prior Israeli elections, we can remember, for example, when Benjamin Netanyahu, the former prime minister, had huge banners of himself, pictures of himself, you know, that said, you know, Netanyahu, another league, right? Pictures with Vladimir Putin. And obviously he wouldn't have done that if he didn't think it was going to play well to Israeli public opinion. So I wonder.
That's one of the reasons, for instance, just mentioning that poster and that image that Netanyahu bolstered over the years, that's one of the reasons that for Bennett, it's extremely important to have that same relationship with Putin, because Bennett is trying to fill Netanyahu's shoes now. So by him flying out to the Kremlin, he was actually proving politically, internally, that Netanyahu is not a different league, that Israel is a different league, but not Netanyahu, or Bennett is a different league, but not only Netanyahu. Now, regarding Israeli public opinion about the leaders, totally right, but it's true. Also, Israelis loved Trump while the whole of the Western world didn't really like him. So it's similar with Putin. Their closeness with Netanyahu, their relationship with Netanyahu made them extremely popular. And also, I think there's something in the Israeli psyche that, of course, was accustomed to Netanyahu's kind of leadership, that adores and admires strong leaders, or at least, and even maybe populist leaders in that respect. And that's some of Putin's source of power. But that being said, what happened in Israel in the past month regarding opinions towards Putin is quite dramatic, because when you ask, when Israelis were asked in the polls, who do they support in the war, Russia or Ukraine? Then you see a constant majority, wide majority, that supports Ukraine and not Russia. And that is surprising if you take into account how popular Putin is to begin with. Of course, in any other place in the world, it seems normal that most of the majority supports Ukraine and only a minority supports Russia. But here in Israel, the fact that the majority supports Ukraine, and it's a large majority, it's about 76 to 80% that support Ukraine, and only 10% maybe that say that they support Russia, which is also an interesting number given how large the Russian-speaking population here is in Israel. And also there's a quite, I think, there's a consensus, or at least an almost consensus on the neutrality, on the neutrality approach. You see about between 60 to 70% of Israelis support Israel keeping a very cautious approach towards Putin and not taking the strongest measures possible. So I think in a way that public opinion on the big questions, there was a large consensus. Then when you go down to the small questions on was Bennett wise to go to the Kremlin, or do you support Bennett's mediation efforts, that's where you start to have not so much consensus, and that kind of is divided between supporters of the government, and whoever is against the government is also against whatever Bennett does. It doesn't really matter.
Great. So to follow up on this point, we have a question in the Q&A from Eva Seligman-Kennard, who's interested in drilling down a little bit within public opinion. You mentioned, of course, and we all know that there is a large community of Russian speakers, of Israelis who immigrated from what is now Russia, the former Soviet Union. What is the position within that community on the conflict and on Israeli policy?
So it's a huge community and it has multi-generations. So I think talking about, I can't attest to their stance like at large. I think that, again, a lot of many of the Russian speakers here are Ukrainian, not even Russian, right? So first of all, you had a lot of people who were just concerned for their families and for their friends, and who are still concerned for their family and friends. And I think first of all, the first response is just a humanitarian response and a nationalistic response. And this comes from all sides. Then I think it really depends on ages. I think, of course, the younger population is against Putin and is pro-Ukrainian. Maybe the more older generation might be a bit more inclined to support Putin. I'm saying this because we also have many Russian-speaking members of Knesset and Russian-speaking politicians. So, for instance, the most senior one of them, the finance minister, Avigdor Lieberman, today he spoke on Israeli radio about Bocha, and he didn't condemn the Russians, and he even said he was kind of, there are two sides and we have to wait and see. Nobody knows which two sides he's talking about, but that I think reflects, if that's what Lieberman said, I can assume that there are sections of the Russian-speaking public that feel the same, that feel maybe that Israel doesn't have to, necessarily condemn Putin on everything, and doesn't necessarily, by the way, have to take such an active approach in mediating or in trying to finish the conflict.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I want to talk about another aspect of this for Israel, which is the refugee crisis. There's been a very profound question in Israel about Israel's admission to take non-Jewish refugees, right? Obviously, when it comes to taking Jewish refugees from the crisis, I think there's agreement across Israel that this is part of Israel's raison d'etre. But then there's the question about non-Jewish refugees. And there was an article in the New York Times, which I'm sure many folks will have seen, which said that, you know, the refugee crisis has ignited an Israeli debate over the purpose of a Jewish state. Obviously, that's not a new debate, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this has played out in Israel.
So yeah, also, there was a very vivid debate at the beginning on the refugee policy, which was basically, I would say, very traditionally divided between left, right, and center, right? So you have right-wing Israelis who think that the Jewish is more important than the democratic, and they were not very much about, they're not very keen about opening Israel up to non-Jews, and their main focus is saving the Jews, and that's why, and their main focus is strengthening Aliyah and bringing more Jews to Israel. Then you have the left-wing parts of the coalition who think that Israel should be opening up its borders altogether to any refugee. Then you have the Russian-speaking Knesset members who are basically dealing on a daily basis with all of the humanitarian cases and have their own criticism of the bureaucracy. Israeli has a horrible bureaucracy with anything that has to do with immigration, both for Israelis, and it's even worse, of course, for non-Israelis. Whoever comes to Israel, you know, knows the process of, it's very, everything that has to do with immigration here. An interior minister at large, even taking out a new passport or an ID, the bureaucracy is horrible. So trying now to bring you know, Ukrainian Jews on a speedy aliyah to Israel is very, very complicated. So the left is saying we have to open up the borders to everyone, and then you have the center, which basically is Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, who think everything has to be done with a measure. We shouldn't be closing, and we shouldn't be closing at large, and we shouldn't also be accepting everyone who comes here. Like, everything should be done with a measure. At the end of the, and this was a huge debacle with the interior minister, Ayelet Shaked. It doesn't help that the interior minister is the interior minister today is Ayelet Shaked, a right-wing politician who is always looking to make points with the right-wing base, who are very angry with her for forming this coalition to begin with. So any chance that Ayelet Shaked has to try and gain points with her former electorate, that's what she will do. So for Ayelet Shaked, to begin, she started out with a very, very strict policy that nobody really understood what was about. That was, of course, the pressure of the right-wing Jews-only approach. After a lot of public criticism, they changed the policy, and basically they have like there have been a very large number of refugees who have entered Israel, because the policy says that whoever has a family member in Israel can come to Israel on a temporary visa. Most of them have, like, there are tons of Ukrainians in Israel. So they're about, I don't know, they're about, I think 12,000 or 13,000 refugees who have came in now, and most of them are not olim chadashim. So most of them are here temporarily. This did spark, yes, a constant question. Now the question is, the debate is, why aren't all of these olim coming? Like, Israel sent all of these, sent tons of people and personnel to all of the countries surrounding Ukraine to try and offer Ukrainian Jews who fled to come on Aliyah. And surprise, surprise, they're not running to come on Aliyah. Many of them want to stay close. They think they'll be back to their homes very soon. Many of them prefer to go to other European countries in which they know the language or in which they know the culture. There are a lot less olim chadashim that I think the Israeli government expected. The numbers are much lower. There have been some very, I would say, pinpointed cases of awful cruelness with immigration, with people who were denied entry to Israel. there have been several cases of people who have tried to enter Israel in the past or lived here in the past and were deported and then tried to come in again under the auspices of the war as refugees. None of this does very well to Israel. But I got to say, at the end of the day, after a month, I think that the mechanism is starting to work. And the one of the problems is that the mechanism is also very, very slow and old and corrupt. And the whole Israel has, on the one hand, it doesn't have a real immigration policy, right? It only has like a aliyah policy. It doesn't have an immigration policy. It only has an aliyah policy about Jews, but there's no policy, real policy about non-Jews. So on the one hand, you have no immigration policy, but on the other hand, you have this extreme monster of bureaucracy in immigration. And between these two, there's a huge mess. And I'm not sure this will be treated now, but some of it is coming up in this debate as well.
Thanks, Tal. We have a question in the Q&A from Jeff Dworetz. He is noting that news reports indicate that Russians are leaving, some Russians are leaving Russia due to their disgust with the war. And so I wonder, Jeff asks, if Israel is seeing a significant influx of Jewish immigrants from Russia.
I don't know how significant it has been, but yes, I do know that there is a wave of immigrants arriving from Russia. As well, again, you know, here in Israel, I gotta say, to be honest, like up until a month ago, I don't think that most Israelis even knew that there was a difference between the Ukrainian Jews here and the Russian Jews here. When they come here, you know, they're all Russian speakers, and that's how they are treated. But one should say there's a huge diaspora, like for Russians in Israel. And it's a very successful one. At the end of the day, when you look at all of the immigration waves that Israel have had from all the countries throughout all of its history, the Russian immigration is the one that succeeded best to become part of Israeli society. Just look at the number of Russian Knesset members. There's no minority that is represented in such numbers. They have, I think, maybe 9 or 10 at least 10 Russian speaking, at least 10, perhaps 12 or 13 Russian speaking Knesset members. So Israel is a good place who forever wants to leave home. It's just, I'm under the impression that at least the Ukrainian Jews are not running to come on Aliyah.
All right, I have 2 more questions in the Q&A, and I hate to turn away any questions, so I'm gonna put both of these questions to you, Tal, and then ask you to offer any final thoughts you'd like before we wrap up the call. I'm gonna go to Michelle Altimus's question first, because it ties in, I think, very much to what you're just talking about. She said, how do people going to Israel as immigrants prove that they are Jewish? It's a big question.
I can say right now, I have no idea what the answer is. I don't know the answer, unfortunately. Okay.
Fair enough. Well, that'll have to be a subject of another discussion. It's a big question.
Yeah, you should have. I mean, there are lawyers who deal with immigration, and I'm sorry that I'm so ignorant and I don't know the answer about that, but I've never tried to come to Israel.
No. It's okay, Noah. Sorry, Tal, where did I get Noah from? I know where I got Noah from. My colleague Noah's box just popped up on my screen. Okay, I do want to end with one last question, which I think you will be able to answer for us, and then any final thoughts you may have. Bruce Rosen puts his question in the following way. I'm just going to read it verbatim because I like the way he puts it. How do the Russian oligarchs who have dual citizenship in Israel fit into this mishigas? And if I could just add to that, of course, that segues into the question about sanctions, right? The rest of the world is talking about sanctioning Russian oligarchs. So how is that playing out in Israel?
So Israeli decision makers are at large trying to put that question to sleep, and they will not want us, they don't want us to talk about it too much, and they don't want us to look into it too much. That's because they're not doing much, and they don't intend to do much, especially regarding those with a dual citizenship. Whoever has an Israeli citizenship is basically protected. There are small measures that Israel has done. Of course, if SWIFT is sanctioned, and Israel is part of this, is part of the sanctions on SWIFT. But Israel is really trying, especially those with a dual citizenship, probably will try not to do anything because they are Israeli citizens. And only, there have been some restrictions on planes landing here. The private planes have to leave after 24 or 48 hours, or they can't stay here for long. And there have been, I think, small things that have to do with the bank accounts, but I do understand from the decision is not to do much, or to do as least as possible. And I think this is also coordinated or, communicated to the administration, to the American administration. I gotta say that I feel that there hasn't been a lot of pressure on Israel. I haven't sensed that much international pressure on Israel, at least not on the public level, regarding the sanctions or the oligarchs. That might come up, but so far it's like there have been a few statements, but Israeli politicians say we're going to try not to do more. They're not going to do much more. So that's how they fit into the Michiganers. They are living quite well here.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because there are some leading Russian oligarchs who are also Jewish, some of whom have Israeli citizenship, like Roman Abramovich, for example. And so so
Roman Abramovich is like very interesting, because like a week before the war started, he gave this huge donation to Yad Vashem. And 2 weeks later, they had to denounce it and give it up. And Roman Abramovich is one of the biggest philanthropists in Israel, and there are many like him who are oligarchs who are close to Putin. But so far I haven't seen, at least the Israeli government is trying to not put this issue in the front and try to solve it in quiet ways. I think basically they're trying to hide up that they're not doing much.
Right. And as I'm sure, since this is a J Street call, I'm sure some of our viewers will know that Roman Abramovich is also a huge donor to the City of David settlement project in Jerusalem. So Tal, if you would like to give any thoughts to kind of wrap us up. I mean, this is obviously a, profound, horrifying conflict. One of the things we haven't even touched on is the fact that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, of course, is Jewish. There are just so many ways in which Israel is tied into this. And if you just wanted to leave us with any thoughts before we wrap up.
So I think that there's a song in Hebrew called Eretz Ktana im Safam. It's a small country with a mustache. And it says, a small country and a mustache, half a pin on the map of the world. And I think this whole war was one of those instances in which there was a huge gap between how small Israel is and how significant it wanted to be, or how significant it turned to be, or how important it turned to be. I do think that, I don't think that Israel should be, but this is my personal thought. I thought that Israel is jumping behind its level on trying to mediate in this conflict. I think that as much as Naftali Bennett had to gain from it politically, so did Vladimir Putin gain from it politically, geopolitically. And I think up until this point, Bennett is one of the only leaders in the world who has actually seen Putin since the war began, or one of the Western leaders, or the last Western leader that has met Putin. I'm not sure that's an honor someone wants to go down in history for, but to his defense, I will say, and to his and Lapid's defense, I will say that their motto was that if this can save even one life and even save one battle, and if the messaging that Israel can do because of its unique situation, because both Zelensky and Putin respect their Jewish communities very much and have a strong Jewish connection, if Israel can use that unique position and can save even one life, then it's worth it. And I think on a moral level, they're probably right. I'm not sure that's true in the geopolitical level, but I do think that the intent was genuine. And I think in a way, it didn't succeed because it wasn't doomed to succeed. But, you know, the fact that Israel has strong Jewish communities in places around the world, including the United States, means that it has a special position, and it has a unique position, which is much bigger than how big it is actually on the world. And that makes me, on the one hand, proud, and on the one hand, very afraid, because sometimes that might be, you know, too much a headache for a very small country. And just, we didn't talk about Zelensky at all, and we didn't talk about the Ukrainian complaints about what Israel is giving or not giving them, and is Israel giving enough support to the Ukrainian army or not? I don't know, you know, at the end of the day, I don't know how we will go down in history at the end of this, but I think the way that Israel gives, this is a young government, right? It's also a government without any experience. So some of the mistakes that they are making are maybe forgivable in a way. And I hope that they didn't make mistakes, and that this war will end as soon as possible.
Well, thank you so much, Tal, for that. I think we'll have to leave it there. I want to really appreciate so many folks in our audience today who stayed a little bit after the hour, and thank you for that as well, Tal. And with that, we'll come to a close. Thank you, everybody, so much. Thank you, Tal, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye.